The following is a Movie House Productions podcast.
Up in the sky, there are wings is flying by. Hear it, no dancing cloud, the sign of the sun makes the mother be proud.
Good day, Radio Rick Spector here for Movie House Productions podcasts. And we're brought to you in this broadcast by Arid and Ralston Cereals. Those of us who remember November 22nd, 1963, the Kennedy assassination, consider it the crime of the century, but some dispute that, including our guest today, considering an event of more than 30 years earlier than that, March 1st, 1932, the Lindbergh Kidnapping to be the century's greatest crime. Our guest is Mark Turetsky. He's a Montgomery County, Pennsylvania attorney and historian. And welcome, Mark. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, great to be here, Rick.
I think we're going to have a good show. Now, of course, Mark, no kidnapping is an ordinary circumstance, but why, in your opinion, was the Lindbergh case considered to be the crime of the century?
Well, there was a lot of competition for the crime of the century back when the kidnapping occurred in 1932. There were people who had living memory of Stanford White getting shot by Harry Thaw, and New Jersey, and the Lizzie Borden trial was only in 1892. But the unique thing about the Lindbergh case, and it's difficult for us to put ourselves back in 1932, Charles Lindbergh was the hero of the world. There was no person on the planet as well known, as famous as Charles Lindbergh was. And probably the second most famous person was his son, his infant son, Charles Lindbergh Jr., who at the time of the kidnapping was 18 months old. And the whole world knew about that baby also. And the fact that the hero of the world's son was kidnapped and taken out of the home, taken out of his bedroom, is just so remarkable that no other crime of the century compares. O.J., take a back seat. There's nothing as remarkable as the crime on the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby.
So Charles Lindbergh was more of an icon than any of the other crime cases we talked about. Can you describe for us? Go ahead.
Well, the only comparison would be the assassination of Lincoln. And in fact, when this kidnapping occurred, there were people that were still alive, but certainly America knew about the assassination of Lincoln, and this crime was compared with Booth's assassination of Lincoln. It was on the same plane.
The crime of the 19th century.
Crime of the 19th
Mark,
century.
Take us back to March 1st of 1932. Describe the crime scene for us.
Well, the crime scene took place really no more than 40 miles from Philadelphia, just about 10, 15 miles north of Trenton, at the Lindbergh's home in Hopewell, New Jersey. And what's remarkable is that it was a winter night, March 1st, 1932. And what is remarkable is that Tuesday night, the night of the kidnapping, was the first Tuesday night that Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh and the baby spent at that house. The house had been under construction for about a year, and, go figure, you can't explain it, but the night the kidnapping took place was the first night that they were there on a Tuesday night. And the house is in a very rural area of Hunterdon County. It straddles the Hunterdon-Mercer County border, and even to this day, and I've been out there many times, if you're looking for it, you're going to have a hard time finding it unless you know exactly where it is. It's still there. The house is still there. And the kidnapping occurred, they believe, sometime in the area of maybe 9 or 10 o'clock. The entire family was in the house. There was a dog in the house. And the kidnapping occurred while everyone was in that house, which makes it all the more a frightening and a horrible event when you think about it. To have a child in its crib stolen away in the middle of the night by an unknown intruder. So that's the scene of the crime.
So who discovered the child missing, and what was the immediate reaction?
What happened was the nurse's name was Betty Gal, and there were two other servants in the house, along with Mr. and Mrs. Lindbergh. And that night the baby had a cold, and it's significant that the baby had a cold because the nurse had prepared a handmade flannel gown and put some Vicks Vapor Rub on the child and put this handmade garment on the baby, put the baby to sleep, and put the baby in a sleeping suit, and then went up, put the baby to bed. And then she went in to check on the baby at around 10 o'clock. When she went in, she did not hear the baby breathing, put on a light, looked in the crib, and the child was gone, no baby. She alerted Mrs. Lindbergh and Charles Lindbergh, and the search was on. Lindbergh picked up his rifle, went out, and he noticed a couple of things. In the room, there was a ransom note. On the outside of the house, below the window where the child was sleeping, there was a ladder to the second floor where the baby's room was, and he found a unique ladder. The ladder was a sort of an extension ladder. It appeared to be a handmade ladder. It was in three sections. The ladder was broken, but it was left there. So the evidence that you had was the ladder, a ransom note, and some smudges of mud. There may have been some footprints out there, but once the general alarm went out, the entire house was covered by police, and a lot of evidence in the way of the footprints and the muddy soil outside of the house below the window was all damaged and corrupted by the foot traffic around the crime scene.
So how were these pieces put together to come up with the arrest of our suspect?
It's a very interesting story. It's a very interesting story, which makes for part of the reason why it is such a remarkable case from the standpoint of forensic evidence and from the standpoint of studying it as from a legal perspective. Lindbergh called the New Jersey State Police. The policeman in charge of the investigation was a man named H. Norman Schwarzkopf, who happened to be the father of H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the hero of the Gulf War.
Yes.
And instead of allowing the New Jersey police to investigate the crime, Lindbergh, because he was Lindbergh, and only because he was Lindbergh, the police, the FBI, federal agents, they all deferred to Lindbergh. And Lindbergh had one thing in mind, and that one thing was to get his child back. And when he was presented with the ransom note, he opened it up, he read it, and it was a very unusual ransom note. It was written in kind of a garbled kind of English, but the English was apparent that the man that wrote it was not a native English speaker, but rather a person that spoke the German language. And it had a provision for ransom, and it had provision for a certain symbol. 3 intersecting circles was the symbol on the ransom note, and the ransom note writer said that when you see this symbol, this signature, he called it, on any ransom notes, you'll know you'll be dealing with the real kidnappers. Lindbergh decided that he was going to negotiate with the kidnappers. Things did not work out. And what happened was a man in the Bronx, a man by the name of John Condon, he was a retired school teacher. He wrote a letter to a local Bronx newspaper, said that he was ashamed that the hero of America would be victimized by such un-American criminals to kidnap his child, that he would agree to be the go-between, and for the return of the child, he would offer his own money, and he was ready, willing, and able to perform this. Nobody knew about this man, except his letter appears in this newspaper, and lo and behold, a few days later, Condon receives a letter in the mail. And he receives the letter, and although this sounds incredible, he picks up the phone and calls Lindbergh. And he says, I have this letter. And Lindbergh at first thought it was a crank, but he said, well, you open up the letter. He opened up the letter, and inside was another ransom letter with the 3 interlocking circles as a signature, so he knew he was dealing with the real kidnappers. There were a number of meetings between Condon and the kidnapper, about 2 or 3, where he spoke to the kidnapper, and there was an exchange of ransom money. And the ransom money was $50,000, and what's important about the ransom money is that in 1932, although Roosevelt had not been elected, Hoover was still the president, everyone with any sense of what was going on, was aware that the United States was going to go off the gold standard. And at that time, you still had circulating gold notes. Now, gold notes, some people probably have never seen a gold note, but they think that a gold note is gold in appearance. Well, it's not. It looks like the money that we use today, at the same size, but the seal, instead of a green seal that we have today on our Federal Reserve notes, on gold notes you have a gold seal. And these things became very scarce eventually when the United States went off the gold standard. And the idea was to pay all the ransom money in these gold notes and to write down the serial numbers of all these notes so that they would be traceable. Initially, Lindbergh did not want to do this. He just wanted his child back, which is entirely understandable. But the FBI prevailed, and the ransom money was paid in the gold notes. The ransom money was paid. The kidnapper gave some instructions on where to find the child. The child was not found. And then approximately after the ransom money was paid in early May of 1932, two truck drivers were traveling from Hopewell, New Jersey. One of them stopped on the road to go into the woods to relieve himself, and they found the Lindbergh, the body of the baby. So
Tell us a little bit about Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a really detestable man, to say the least.
The thing about Hauptmann is that once the baby's body is found, all bets are off. And the evidence that they had was the ladder, which was a handmade ladder, and the ransom notes and the ransom money. That's about it. Bruno Richard Hauptmann ended up as being the suspect, and he was arrested, and he was tried, and he was convicted, and he was executed. Hauptmann was arrested when a gasoline station attendant received a $10 gold note. And he was suspicious about it because 2 years had gone by after the kidnapping before Hauptmann was arrested. And by that time, all the gold notes and all the gold coins had been recalled by Roosevelt as part of the banking reforms of the New Deal. And he decided that when he got this gold note, which Hauptmann paid him, he wrote down some numbers on the bill. And a bank teller looked at those numbers, noticed that it was a ransom bill, handed it over to the police, and the police recognized that those numbers that had been written down on the bill was the license number of a car. They traced it back to the gasoline station, and Bruno Richard Hauptmann was the registered owner of that vehicle. He was arrested the next day, and what they found in his house was $14,000 of the gold certificates, and it turned out that Bruno Richard Hauptmann was a carpenter. And when they went through a lot of his papers and things, they found sketches that matched the ladder, similar to the ladder. And they also had him write various handwriting exemplars to compare his handwriting to the ransom notes. And to this day, it's debated as to whether or not the handwriting experts got it right. But the wood and the currency that they found on him pretty much was the evidence that was used to convict him. Today, people still say, Hauptmann was railroaded, he didn't get a fair trial. Well, the fact is, he was railroaded, he didn't get a fair trial. However, the evidence is overwhelming, points to Bruno Hauptmann as the man responsible for this.
What was Hauptmann's defense? What did he have to say in his behalf?
Hauptmann's defense was that he had gotten the money from a friend of his by the name of Isidore Fish. And he portrayed Isidore Fish as a shifty guy, and he had the money, and he gave it to Hauptmann to hold because he was going back to Germany. And everyone said, well, where is Fish? We've got to talk to Fish. Fish conveniently died in Germany of tuberculosis, and that was his sort of alibi story. The other alibi was, when you think about it, there were no witnesses that saw Bruno Hauptmann with that child, and all the witnesses that placed him at the site of the kidnapping were clearly not really credible witnesses. They had one witness who was legally blind. They had another witness who was known in the community as a world-class liar, and he testified that he saw Hauptmann out there. But there's no real hard evidence that Hauptmann was in that house. The evidence of the latter, however, a astute detective, when they went through Hauptmann's house, they noted that there was pieces of wood missing from an attic floor. And it looked as though, one of these pieces of wood may have matched the wood that was used to make the ladder. And the forensic evidence regarding the wood really is the most amazing part of the story. Even before Hauptmann was arrested, the ladder had gone to a wood expert by the name of Keeler at the United States Department of Agriculture Wood Laboratory in Wisconsin. And he analyzed the wood, and he made a note. He said, there's one piece of wood that looks like it's different from the other pieces of wood. And this piece of wood looks like it was kept indoors for a significant period of time. 3 years went by. Hauptmann's arrested. The detective's in his attic, and they find a piece of wood that's been sawed in a particular way. And the expert was able to link up and show that the piece of wood on the ladder had once been part of a piece of wood in Hauptmann's attic. And to this day, of all the issues that people argue that Hauptmann didn't do it couldn't have been Hauptmann, the wood testimony and the expertise that was used back in 1932, and again, they didn't have DNA to compare the wood samples, which they could use today. The evidence that this scientist put forward with regard to the microscopic analysis of the two pieces of wood certainly would lead any reasonable individual to believe that the wood that was used to make that ladder came from a piece of wood that was at Hauptmann's house.
We're going to take a break right now, Mark, for a word from one of our sponsors, Arid, and we'll be back in just a moment with Mark Turetsky, attorney and historian of the Lindbergh Kidnapping case.
Is the sweetheart you married the husband you expected him to be? Has the war created new problems for you in your marriage? To answer these and other personal problems brought in by your friends and neighbors, Arid presents John J. Anthony, founder of the famed Marital Relations Institute, in a brand new program of daily sessions of kindly and helpful advice. Just as Mr. Anthony, by examples in this studio, is helping thousands of men and women solve their personal problems, Arid, too, is helping thousands to solve the important personal problem of underarm perspiration.
We're back with Mark Turetsky. A turbulent trial. How was the trial covered in the media?
Trial in the media was one of the remarkable trials of the 20th century in the sense that it was a media circus. You had Walter Winchell, Hollywood stars, thousands of people converged on the courthouse in Hunterdon County in the town of Flemington, New Jersey, and the courtroom is still there. The presiding judge was a very able judge, a judge named Judge Trenchard. The defense attorney for Hauptmann was a man by the name of Riley. His name was Ed Riley. He had a reputation in Brooklyn as being a masterful criminal lawyer, the kind of guy that could get the guilty off. By the time he started representing Hauptmann, he was in bad shape. He was suffering from tertiary syphilis. He had a tremendous drinking problem. He was a regular visitor to the divorce courts, and he was compromised because his legal fees were being paid by the Hearst newspaper syndicate, and the Hearst newspaper syndicate was particularly looking forward to having Hauptmann convicted. And Hauptmann and his wife, Anna Hauptmann, were not real happy with Ed Riley. The jurors, by and large, were very intelligent, ordinary folk from the vicinity of Lambertville and outside of the area around where the trial took place. And they were just ordinary people, but they were not fools. And they were kind of turned off by Mr. Riley. They didn't care for his highfalutin New York ways, and the New Jersey State was represented in Flemington by Attorney General Walentz, who had never tried a criminal case before. He was against the death penalty, but he did a remarkable performance in putting together all this technical evidence involving the handwriting and the ladder. But when you read the transcripts, the prejudice and the arguments that were used were clearly over and beyond anything you could do today. There was a strong anti-immigration theory to this, that no American could kidnap. It would have to be a foreigner. It would have to be a German. It would have to be somebody like Hauptmann, because, again, this is before World War II, but most of the people were certainly veterans of World War I. And Hauptmann had fought in the war. He had been a machine gunner, and he was an illegal alien, and he even had a criminal record from Germany to boot. So they went all the way out to prejudice the minds of the jurors toward Hauptmann. And the judge was as fair as could be, but there's a lot of people say that when he charged the jury in this case, he leaned over to favor the prosecution in ways that would be reversible error today. So that was the trial.
Hauptmann's death sentence. What was the reaction?
The reaction to the death sentence was that everybody was sort of a foregone conclusion. However, because of the unusual circumstances and because of the lack of real evidence of putting Hauptmann there were a lot of people that doubted the judgment. Eleanor Roosevelt doubted the judgment. A lot of people doubted the judgment, and even the governor of New Jersey, a man named Hauptmann, doubted the verdict and felt that Hauptmann had been unfairly railroaded. He was sentenced to death. There were a number of appeals. Riley was out of the case, and there was a couple of local attorneys from New Jersey that were involved. And one of them was a man by the name of Lloyd Fisher. And Lloyd Fisher was a very dedicated lawyer, believed in his client, and went as far as he could go with appeals. But in those days, and today we have a lot of protections that were not available back in 1932. Today, you have some due process rights that were not recognized as rights that were obligations of the states in those days. So a lot of things that you would think would have been raised on appeal were not raised on appeal at that time, and they raised a lot of technical things on appeal, such as that the basis for the death sentence, and you've got to hear this, Rich, is that kidnapping was not a capital offense. You could not get the death penalty for kidnapping. So they tried Hauptmann on the theory of felony murder. And the felony murder doctrine is that you can be convicted of a murder if a death occurs in the commission of a felony. And kidnapping is not a felony, but the felony for the felony murder was the stealing of the baby's clothing, the clothing that the baby wore. The clothing was that nightshirt and the little shirt that the nursemaid made. And when the Hauptmann went into the house, took the baby, took the clothing, that was a felony. That was a burglary, stealing of property. And that's what it was based on.
Wasn't Hauptmann offered the opportunity, if he confessed, to have the sentence waived?
The governor of Jersey was convinced, and the one unsatisfying thing about the verdict against Hauptmann was it was impossible for anybody to believe that he did it himself. There would have had to have been inside help. How did he know they were there? There was nothing to connect him to that property, nothing to show that he had anybody work. There had to be outside help. There had to be other people, and people wanted to find out the rest of the story. Governor Hauptmann offered to pardon Hauptmann if he would speak. And Hauptmann went to his death convinced he was an innocent man. He convinced his wife that he was an innocent man, convinced his lawyer, Lloyd Fisher, that he was an innocent man, and he could have saved his life. But he was a very strong personality. There may be some comparisons between the strong personality of Lindbergh and the strong personality of Hauptmann, and perhaps Hauptmann had in his mind that he was a Superman and he was going to show a few things to Lindbergh, and there may have been a rivalry in his mind. Who knows? But he never admitted to anything and was executed. One of the things they did, there was a famous lawyer named Samuel Leibowitz. He was the lawyer that defended the Scottsboro boys in the 1930s in Alabama. And they brought Leibowitz in to speak to Hauptmann to get him to confess. Because if Leibowitz could get him to confess, Hauptmann's life would be saved. But he would not say anything, not at all. Leibowitz made it as scary as possible and get Hauptmann to confess, but he did not.
And Anna Hauptmann carried this crusade to her deathbed too. What transpired there?
to the end of her life, and she lived in Yaden, Pennsylvania. She was a supporter of her husband, and in the 1980s, she brought a number of lawsuits against then Governor Byrne in the state of New Jersey and some of the surviving state policemen that were still alive to raise some of these issues about the trial and the conviction, contending that they violated her husband's civil rights. Those cases went nowhere. They were all dismissed by the Third Circuit in Philadelphia. But she died about 20 years ago, less than 20 years ago. She died in the 1990s. Went to her death still convinced that her husband was an innocent man and had been railroaded in this matter.
We're going to take another break here. Interesting discussion with Mark Turetsky about the Lindbergh kidnapping case. A few words from Shred and Ralston. We'll be right back.
Say, here's how to make breakfast as exciting as a circus and a 3-day rodeo rolled into one.
Shredded Ralston for your breakfast. Start the day off shining bright. Gives you lots of cowboy energy with a flavor that's just right. It's delicious and nutritious, bite-sized and ready to eat. Take a tip from Tom, go and tell your mom Shredded Ralston can't be beat.
Back here with Mark Turetsky, historian, attorney, expert on the Lindbergh kidnapping case. Mark, let's bring it up to the present. For those of our listeners who are traveling historians, so to speak, what is out there today, sites, physical sites, that might connect people to the case?
There's a lot out there. First, you can go to Flemington and you can visit the historic courtroom where the trial took place. The furnishings and the outfitting of the courtroom were just the same as they were back in 1935 when they had the trial. And the Lindbergh house is still there. It's called Highfields. After the kidnapping, the Lindberghs never lived in the house again, and they gave the house to the state of New Jersey, where it's been used as a halfway house for juvenile delinquents, as they were called in those days. I've been out there a couple of times. They've made some changes to the downstairs, but you can go up. I've been in the room where that kidnapping occurred, and when you go there and you visit the scene of the crime, you cannot fathom how it was possible for Hauptmann or anybody else to climb up that rickety ladder to the second floor, open the window, go in, get the child, climb out the window, go down the ladder. It's just, you can't fathom that it could happen. The window is still there. It's the same window. It's a narrow little window. How somebody could have done it, and if you saw the ladder, you couldn't imagine how it was done. And after you visit there, what you want to do is go to the New Jersey State Police Museum in Ewing Township, New Jersey, in West Trenton, and they have a remarkable exhibit of all the evidence of the Lindbergh trial. So you can see the ladder, you can see the ransom notes, you can see all of the exhibits. It's quite remarkable. And the archivist there is a fellow by the name of Mark Fellini. He's a very approachable man, and he is an expert in the case, and he can show you a lot of the evidence there. And if you're very nice to him, he'll let you sit in the electric chair, which I had the pleasure of doing. So
shocking.
Those are really places where you can go and see an awful lot of the case and get a better understanding of what the case was all about.
For our readers, could you recommend a couple books? Want to follow up on the Lindbergh case?
There's a book by Jim Fisher, who is a professor at Edinburgh State University, called the Lindbergh Case, and that's published by Rutgers University, and that's a wonderful book. And there's another one by a historian out of Rutgers also, Lloyd Gardner's book called The Case That Never Dies, the Lindbergh Kidnapping, and that's also published by Rutgers University. And if you're interested in a very interesting fictional take, you would want to read Max Allan Collins, is a great mystery writer. His book is Stolen Away, and that's a fascinating book. We've tipped the iceberg here, but a lot of interesting people from the 30s were involved. You had J. Edgar Hoover, all the news reporters, Norman Schwarzkopf. You had a lot of people involved in this thing that were involved in the case. And Charles Lindbergh, Gaston Means, Evelyn Walsh McLean, a lot of characters from
Bevy of characters
in this case.
Mark, understand you did a special presentation, a mock trial, so to speak, about the case for the Montgomery County Bar Association?
Yes, our Bar Association, we've used this as a forum for teaching trial advocacy issues, ethics issues regarding the representation of Hauptmann. and a comparison between due process today and due process back in the 1930s to see if even today would Hauptmann get a fair trial, or could he be tried today? So the case goes on. It's still a mystery, although it's like all things. As time goes on, it's been, I guess, 88 years since the kidnapping. Memories sort of fade, but a lot of wonderful material to go through and think about.
A case that will never die.
That's
thanks
right.
From Rick Spector, Movie House Productions, to our special guest, historian and attorney Mark Turetsky, for a really lively presentation about the Lindbergh kidnapping case of, close to 90 years ago. Thanks for being with us, Mark.
You're welcome, Rick. Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Honolulu, baby, where'd you get those eyes and those pretty red lips? I just idolize. Honolulu, baby, where'd you get that style and the pretty dimples and the pretty smile? When you start to dance, you put 'em in a trance, shaking it up and down.